Hello, I'm Scott Davison. I'm Dean of the Colorado College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Morehead State University. This is the Colorado Conversations, a series of discussions about issues of contemporary or perennial interest where we highlight the expertise of the faculty from the college. And joining me tonight is Dr. Lane Nieper, Emeritus Professor of English from Morehead State, and Sarah Payton, who teaches social studies at our local public high school, Round County High School. Thank you both for joining me today. We're going to be talking about the history of American self-narrative. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Nieper, who's going to tell us about some of the history of American literature and the search for a distinctive American voice. So I'll begin with you, Lane, if you don't mind.
I have written about the earliest efforts in 19th century America at literary canon formation, or the first formal attempts to designate what is and isn't American literature and to nominate who are the important and enduring canonical authors in our tradition. Canonical means those works and authors that a culture comes to regard as the most significant and aesthetically worthy, whatever those terms may be defined to mean. What I have found is that the first efforts to promote a national canonical literature were made by literary historians writing the story of American letters in book-length histories, first in the mid-19th century and then in the last decades of the 1800s. Historiographer Hayden White has helped us understand that every act of writing history is more fictional than historians may want to admit. A history should not be regarded as the objective and true version of the past. Rather, histories, and in this case, American literary histories, are implotted, given plot lines, and consciously and unconsciously crafted to produce certain coherent outcomes. In other words, White would have us remember that all recorded histories are narratives outfitted with selective facts and advancing particular perspectives. These literary histories, like all histories, are sophisticated stories, but they are stories nonetheless. In the case of the earliest literary histories that we have from the 1830s to the 1850s, we find the first arbiters of canon formation plotting their works in a way that emphasizes the tragic aspects of literary production in the young republic. In doing so, these literary historians identify a central irony that is animating the tragic story of American letters. The tragedy is this: we have an abundance, an overabundance of literary works that have miraculously sprung up in a developing, largely wild continent. Historians employ a rhetoric of plenitude. There's so much American literature to revere, but tragically, that wealth of literary expression is still unrecognized and unappreciated by a literate public that, even after a revolution, would still prefer English writers and works to their American counterparts. These earliest histories include an omnivorous range of texts besides poems and novels that are designated as literature. Examples include the writing of cartographers, ornithologists, and orators, but alas, few works by women and no writings of any sort or recognition, for that matter, perhaps not surprisingly, of Americans of color. The point of these first narratives is that young America has a great tradition of literature on these shores, but the upstart country has been ignorant, tragically so, of that literary, political, cultural achievement. By the time of the second generation of literary histories written in the decades of Reconstruction and after waves of European immigration in the late 19th century, the narrative imperatives for telling the story of canonical American literature turned decidedly corrective in nature. The expansive first wave of histories are now severely curtailed. The later histories are now implotted as comedies, in the same way that Dante's great poem, The Divine Comedy, is comedic. That is to say, there is satisfying resolution, the proverbial happy ending prevails. No longer scouring the historical record for any written or even oral work by a white male American and deeming that text literature, the second generation literary historians seek aggressively to limit the American canon so that it now represents the best, the most representative, and the most accomplished creators of American literary art. The taming canon of the early literary histories is replaced by a severely restricted coterie limited to the best writers that a young country has been able to nurture and sustain. The second generation histories promote a satisfying end to a century and a half of perceived literary impoverishment, but one now crowned with the glory of Irving, Cooper, Hawthorne, Poe, and Emerson, and not too many others. These later historians' canon is exclusive and exclusionary and limits the representative art of America to the production of an elite few, an elite that is white, male. These late 19th century literary histories have proven to be surprisingly long-lasting. Many of the small group of authors identified in the 1870s and 1880s are still at the heart of what canonical 19th century American literature is thought to be in the 21st century. And that small group of writers still make regular and insistent appearances on high school reading lists and university syllabi to this day. It has only been through prolonged and ongoing attempts by previously marginalized Americans and their advocates that those earlier narratives have been challenged, reimagined, and rewritten as more inclusive narratives of American literature, supplying new stories of what our national literature should tell us about ourselves.
Thank you, Lane. It's very interesting to hear about the idea of history and the myth of simply recording what happened. I think, Sarah, you can share some perspective on this too, especially in light of recent events that involve the telling of the American story. Why don't you share with us some of your thoughts about how this goes, especially with reference to your experience in trying to teach American history?
So, teaching American history over the past several years has become challenging in ways that didn't really exist, I would say 10, 15, even 5 years ago. There is a debate over whether teachers should or should not be political. And that balance has been difficult to find. And just like Lane was talking about what stories to include, what represents America, that applies to the story of history, right? The stories we tell in our classrooms. And while teachers may try to refrain from being overtly partisan, we also have the obligation to teach our students right from wrong, and we can't be afraid to do so. Um, Politics has complicated the use of curriculum as well, as politicians who clearly have no true understanding of history inject their opinions into the public forum. So 2 years ago, the New York Times issued or published a journalism project called the 1619 Project, which is the year in which Africans were first brought into the British colonies. And its purpose was, and I quote from their statement, was to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. For quite a long time, just like Lane was talking about, those contributions and those stories were excluded. They were overlooked. They didn't make the history books. So 1619 did generate controversy. Some historians took issue with some of the ideology expressed, others claimed some factual dispute with the content, but it certainly broadened the American narrative. And as a teacher, I did use the 1619 Project with students. We read and analyzed some of the pieces. We discussed controversial statements they may have found and even aspects they disagreed with. But I use it because history is about looking at events from multiple perspectives. I try to teach my students that, history is about empathy. It is about looking at the world from someone else's point of view, putting yourself in their shoes and trying to understand their choices and their actions. And the 1619 Project is a valuable springboard for doing that. However, in reaction to the 1619 Project, at the end of 2020, the former president issued an executive order establishing the 1776 Commission. And its stated purpose was to, again, I quote, end the radicalized view of American history, which has vilified the United States founders and its founding, end quote. So clearly it was established to try to diminish or combat the 1619 Project. It was a ploy to remove the voices and experiences of non-white Americans. It did not even acknowledge Native Americans in its curriculum in its outline of history. And most revealing, not one historian was actually even on that commission. It was purported, or it purported itself to be, quote, a patriotic education. And patriotic education is simply propaganda. We have seen the path that other nations have taken with patriotic education, and that's Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. It is a dangerous path to go on. That's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to teach kids how to think. On a personal level, it's been challenging to teach history in this time. I once had a parent complain to an administrator about me pushing my liberal agenda. And when the parent was asked what she found problematic, it was that I was teaching the civil rights movement. No, that's just basic historical fact. That's not partisan. And this political and social environment we found ourselves in have politicized just fundamental events, facts, and figures in ways that are very bothersome. And to me personally, the most frustrating fact is that politicians accuse history teachers of teaching their students to hate America. And that could not be farther from the truth. Students have to know that every leader we've had is flawed, that these ordinary people who do extraordinary things are complicated, they evolve, they change, their views on things change, and we've made mistakes as a nation, and we have to own that and we have to understand it. There was a columnist in the Washington Post recently that wrote a column, and he wrote something that I will quote to every class I teach from here on out. And he said, history class isn't intended to teach students to love their country or to loathe their country. History class is intended to teach them how to live in it. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I often tell students the analogy of, we may deeply love our friends, our partners, our family members, but that doesn't mean we overlook their flaws and their weaknesses. And it's the same with a nation. You can love your nation and you can have patriotism and loyalty, but you also recognize its weaknesses, its mistakes. And ultimately, I would argue that's a more authentic kind of love anyway. And so, trying to find that balance of how to teach students right from wrong, how to include all of the voices in the American story, it has become very challenging in ways that it wasn't, I would say, years ago.
Thank you, Sarah. That is really fascinating. And of course, we're in a really interesting time right now as this struggle over how to tell the American story has boiled over, not just on the national political scene, but even into your classroom. I'm curious to know what the two of you think about whether this struggle, how to tell our story as a nation, is how we got here and who we are today. Do you think that struggle will continue indefinitely? Do you see no end in sight for this kind of battle over the national identity?
Well, I think just like the American project, and in literature classes are going to continue to attempt to remake, remold this ongoing narrative. I don't see any stopping. Can you ever have too much democratic inclusion? Do you reach a point of satiation? I don't think so. So I think as we continue to see more and more voices brought in to the political spectrum and into the conversations, that's going to be reflected also in our classrooms as well. So I don't see it ending.
Yeah, and I think the students, as they, for better or worse, social media enlightens students to things, and they become more aware. And students that I work with today are, I think, more politically aware and active than I would say students were 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I think it was funny. I was talking to a student the other day, and he's a junior in high school, and he aspires to be a U.S. senator someday. And we were talking about, how will true political change happen? And he said, as my generation moves into politics, that perhaps in a generation or two, there will be fundamental change in our democratic representation and in the way we function as a country. But I do think that for now, that struggle will continue, and we will, as we do. And I was thinking, like, a few years ago, the term alternative facts was, became a reality, and that we are the world of science and the world of history is constantly uncovering new facts. We're uncovering new voices and new stories, new data, and that will continue to broaden the voices that are represented and the information that we have access to. So I foresee it being here for a while as well.
It's interesting you both mentioned the sort of current pressures on a single narrative here and the sort of growing diversity of voices, and social media, obviously, as you said, Sarah, plays a role in this. And it also, I think about when I was young and we didn't have social media and we had a kind of national news network that kind of everybody sort of agreed on the facts as presented by the news. And there were certainly shortcomings to that approach. But we've also seen sort of globally a decline in democracy and also a shift away from trust in experts. This seems to come along with the growth of trust in social media. I wonder if skepticism about experts plays a role here in explaining this debate about how to frame the American story. It's interesting to notice, Sarah, you pointed out that the 1776 panel didn't have any historians. So I would think of those people as experts, about this question, and they were not included. Do you think that is there something going on here about the role of experts, and is that something to be welcomed or something to be mourned? Let's start with you this time, Sarah.
I think in this day and age, many people consider themselves experts on everything, right? And so there is this fundamental questioning of those supposed experts who are in their field. And I think when I look at the field of history, I mean, the narrative that was taught in textbooks 130 years ago, 100 years ago, was the lost cause narrative that was put into place by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And, that narrative dominated education for decades. And, in recent decades, we have come to understand where that came from and the purpose. And I think that as we look at the resources and as we uncover, and what I always tell students is you look at multiple resources, you have to have multiple accounts. And just as science collects multiple points of data with history, you have to hear from multiple voices to understand it. So I don't know. I don't know what we will do to respect the experts again. Maybe it will take having leaders in charge who model that for us and who aren't constantly questioning experts. But I think that we also are training teachers in a way that is different now, even than when I went through the education program. And I think that will help make progress as well.
What do you think, Lane?
I don't think we need much more proof that experts are being questioned and are the cause of suspicion than to hear Sarah say that a parent has called her on the carpet about including civil rights documents and facts as part of an agenda, right? Parents have always voiced their concerns to teachers, but there seems to be a new emphasis on calling into question the expertise of teachers and their knowledge. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, there was a very popular book called Tenured Radicals, talked about the academy being the hotbed of liberalism and that it was, in fact, tearing away at the fabric of the nation because we were hearing only one perspective. That, I think, that view has become even more pronounced in the last 10 years, so that there is suspicion of academics as only involving themselves in what could be regarded as radical or liberal perspectives. And therefore, that in and of itself, there's been a great movement in the last 4 years toward trying to root out these kinds of liberal heresies from American universities and high schools, I would assume. That I think is a dangerous element of this distrust of expert testimony and opinion. So,
to go along with that, I'll say, at the beginning of this year, so our state standards mandate that U.S. history begins with Reconstruction. So that is where our curriculum starts. And so at the beginning of the year, my colleague and I that teach this, we had a parent complain that we were teaching about Reconstruction at the beginning of the year. Why would we start with the most divisive time in American history? Why would we try to make America look bad? Why would we not focus on something positive? And, clearly it was an easy answer because the state has mandated this is our curriculum, end of story. But, you're exactly right. Parents have always had opinions about schools, rightly so. But in terms of feeling the freedom to question and to blast us, to put it nicely, for what we teach, that there's certainly more liberal use of that than there was before. And it makes our job tough.
I just want to add, I am retired now. I'm almost a year into my retirement, and the classroom where it had always been easy for me to voice whatever position I wanted had become a much less tenable option. I felt constrained and worried about how I was being perceived, how I was being talked about on social media. If I were, I don't know, but it was more. It made me. I was more paranoid about what I was actually talking about. So.
And it trickles down to the students. I had a student that refused to do an assignment this year because he didn't agree with it. He didn't like the perspective on it. And I mean, yes, that's a teachable moment and all of that, but just that students feel that is an option to tell your teacher, I don't agree with this, so therefore I'm not going to do it. It's a battle.
So what you've described here is this sort of increasing fragmentation of narrative, and then the inability to find common ground, and also suspicion and hostility, and now everyone feeling sort of the right not to listen to the other side in a way. I'm curious to know, you're both educators. You have gone out of your way to appeal to students wherever they are, trying to help them broaden their perspectives, understand more than one side. We know we're not going to sort of reach consensus on the American story once and for all, and resolve all disagreements. Can we hope maybe that people will at least, eschew the most obnoxious possibilities, and maybe recognize that some stories, are involved in exploiting people today? But are you hopeful about the prospects for the next generation? Do you think education is making a difference for our students, and that helps them to navigate this better? Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, or I wouldn't do this job, I guess. But that's not without its moments of discouragement. I'm teaching the Holocaust this week in U.S. history, and I had a student reference doing something silly in middle school with the swastika, Nazi symbol, and other kids that laughed. And there is a matter of teaching, like I said, teaching students right from wrong, what's appropriate, what's not. And we continue to face some profound ignorance, I think is the word for it. There was a 2020 study last year that revealed that over 60% of American adults did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Last month, I believe it was, in Massachusetts, there was a football coach who was fired because one of his plays was called Auschwitz. as much as I want to know and believe that education makes a difference, we have serious obstacles to overcome, and we have so much education to do. But I think, I often ask students to reflect back and tell me, like, at the end of a unit, what did you learn that you did not know before? And I remember after a Reconstruction unit, students were saying they never knew about Black codes. They thought that after the Civil War and slaves were freed, everything was fine. Freed Blacks went on about their lives. They didn't know about the Lost Cause. They didn't know about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I mean, they didn't know that the 13th Amendment led to a mass incarceration system. So I believe that through education, kids can become enlightened and they can understand. And again, I come back to the whole point is empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, day after day, I say that in my class. Imagine you're this, imagine you're so and so. What would you think? What would you feel? What would you experience? And I think if kids can learn how to do that, you know, hopefully that is where hope lies.
Yes, I'm hopeful too, and I was going to circle back to empathy as well, but students need to be provided with appropriate models to empathize with, and that means, in my judgment, a range of peoples and lifestyles. And Morehead State forever has it was a normal school training teachers. It's still very much a teacher training institution, and I'm proud of that. I was fortunate enough to teach the first ever African American literature course at Morehead State, and I taught it several times, and that class was a revelation to white students from Eastern Kentucky. And I know I've heard testimony from some of my former students that, they're teaching Native Son. They're teaching Go Tell It on the Mountain in their classrooms because they saw the need, and they realized their students could also empathize. More than that, too, we have so many young women in the university who also are in our teacher ed classes, and to see women represented in the literature has changed so many lives when they see themselves represented. So and more than that, I for a thinking individual, there's no way to put the genie back in the bottle. Once you've been exposed to an inclusive history of whatever discipline, it is just a sheer act of ignorance to believe there's only one way to tell this, and it's one that belongs to the dominant culture. I think students cannot forget those groups that have been the other when they're trying to think about how to tell a story of American identity. I'm hopeful. I heard Sarah, and I recognize what she's saying about the ignorant things that we hear day in and day out. But the only way to combat that is by more immersion into this democratic project, as I see it.
And I think that goes along too with the idea of teaching students to speak up and to speak out. And, that again, coming back to that quote about learning how to live in our country, we have to teach students that. And I think this generation is more willing to do that in ways, maybe because of social media, maybe because they have a platform, but teaching kids to, when I always use John Lewis as kind of a role model for these students in terms of activism and speaking up when you say something. And so, as they become educated and as they are exposed to things that, like Lane was talking about, and seeing the representation of others, hopefully that will inspire them to take action.
Well, I guess we can do our best and hope for the best. And I appreciate both of you as educators. devoting yourselves to helping students and providing a space safely where they can explore these things together and also share what they're thinking with you, because of course that's a crucial step to understanding um, where to go from here, is to recognize what you think and be able to explore that with somebody. So I want to thank you for joining me in today's Colorado College conversation. This has been super interesting and helpful. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lane.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. It was great listening to Sarah talk too.
You too, Lane.
So I hope you'll join us again for the next Colorado College conversation. Thank you again.